Well, good afternoon and welcome to our school's annual Martin Luther King Day event and address. This year it's part of our Civic Discourse project, and this is the 5th webinar in our theme this academic year on race, justice, and leadership in America. I'm Paul Carisse. I am the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. We are delighted to be joined today by cultural critic and writer Thomas Chatterton Williams to discuss his views on transcending racial categories in relation to Martin Luther King's thought and legacy. Part of our school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time, and each academic year, our speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends the conversations and debates we have in our classrooms to a broader community. You can visit the school's website to see all of our previous lectures the past 4 years in the Civic Discourse Project, and you can learn more about our school, the curriculum, the programs at scetl.asu.edu. We'll have 3 main parts to the hour today. First, a presentation from Thomas Williams. Then I'll pose some questions in a conversation with him. And in the third part, we'll have a Q&A session from the virtual community that's joining us. So we ask you please to type your questions for our guest using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Our colleague, Dr. Carol McNamara, will be collecting those questions behind the scenes, and then I'll be posing them to Thomas Williams in the final segment. So now to our guest, we are delighted to welcome Thomas Chatterton Williams, joining us from Paris, where it is evening already there. He is a prominent essayist, scholar, social commentator, journalist, and author. He's a cultural critic and the author of 2 books, Losing My Cool, Love, Literature, and A Black Man's Escape from the Crowd, 2010, and more recently, Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race, published in 2019. In 2020, he helped write and organize A Letter on Justice and Open Debate, published in Harpers Magazine and reprinted broadly elsewhere. It was a defense of freedom of expression and civil debate against what it called a movement toward ideological conformity and intolerance. It was signed by over 150 prominent figures, including David Brooks, J.K. Rowling, Salman Rushdie, Margaret Atwood, and Cornel West. Thomas Williams is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, a columnist at Harper's, a 2019 New America Fellow, and the recipient of a Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin. He recently became a non-resident fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. He lives and works in Paris with his wife and children. Among other projects right now, he's working on a book on the sources of illiberalism on both the left and the right. Mr. Williams, thank you so much for being our Martin Luther King speaker for 2021, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's an honor to be here today, speaking to you all as we commemorate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It's also an extraordinarily important time in America to be thinking about such topics as race, as our country's collective past, and as our shared path forward into what I sincerely hope will be a better tomorrow on this first day of transition from the extraordinarily polarized era of Donald Trump. One of the first things I tend to think about when I think about the struggle that so many went through so that we could all be free and equal, like many of you, I'm sure, one of the first things that pops into my mind is the face of Martin Luther King, Jr. It's just a reflexive thought. I think of Black history, or I think of the civil rights movement, and I see Martin Luther King. Usually I see him in black and white. I see him in my mind in a kind of grainy resolution. He's addressing the mall in Washington, telling the people gathered there about his dream. Or I see him stepping out onto the balcony of his hotel that fateful day in Memphis, the weight of the world on his shoulders, his face serious and thoughtful, sometimes creased with worry. In my mental portrait of him, he becomes kind of this embodiment of, or personification of struggle, virtue, and forbearance. He seems beyond me and absolutely out of my reach. It's almost as if he is of another species, a higher and better species. So the other day, it stopped me in my tracks when I came across a photograph of him that shows him in a different way than I had ever imagined. The photograph is undated, but I'm sure it's from the 60s because Dr. King looks very much the way he did toward the end of his life. He's young, but no longer such a young man. It's safe to assume that at the time the photo was taken, he was under immense pressure and that he was feeling the burden of leading a movement that was fighting for its life and really for all of our lives. And yet in this photo, you cannot tell any of that. In this photo, Dr. King is perched on the edge of a billiards table. He's surrounded by a crowd of onlookers, all men of varying ages, and he's holding a pool stick behind his back, getting ready to execute a difficult off-balance shot. The smile on his face is wide and happy, even relaxed, and the men who are watching him are smiling and laughing too, as they wait to see if he can pull it off. There's absolutely nothing in this picture to alert you to the fact that Dr. King and the men who surround him are fighting for their lives. For the moment, at least, they're happy and full of joy. In this picture, Dr. King is not a saint or a symbol, but a man, a fully human man capable of attempting a funny-looking behind-the-back shot on the billiards table and tossing his head back in laughter. I say all that because seeing this picture complicated my understanding of what I thought I knew, not just about Dr. King, but about that whole historical moment in America. And it reminded me that more often than not, it is the case that even when we think we know about the past, we don't really know it in full. And the complex texture of those lives and struggles can never be merely boiled down to the preferences and preoccupations of the present moment. And so it's our duty to keep trying to get as full a picture as possible, always. And that thought struck me as an appropriate lesson to keep in mind as I prepared to talk to you today. I don't think it's an exaggeration, or it isn't much of one, to say that there's currently in this country a real crisis of history and historical understanding. I don't mean to say that we don't constantly invoke the past or consult the historical record whenever possible. With the ease of a Google search, we do that today more than ever before. We throw historical references around, often to eschew the much harder work of really scrutinizing what exactly is distinct about today. Excuse me. What I mean is that it seems every time you turn on the television, consult Twitter, or open the newspaper, there's another instance of history being obscured, of the past being smoothed over or redacted, and of historical events being reduced, misunderstood, or twisted in the service of polemical expediency, accusation, or self-flattery. And this is dangerous for the present. On the political landscape, on the one hand, we've avoided the worst. Our democracy was pushed to the breaking point under Donald Trump, but it did not snap. America struggled with itself in a bitterly contested election in which both candidates received more votes than had ever been cast for a single candidate in the history of the land. And I'll be honest, the better version of America won, but barely. It's not a perfect America, certainly not an America that is beyond our vigorous critique, but the version of the country through which we can continue to work to achieve our more perfect union, at the very least in good faith, was not defeated. I believe this and much more is evidence of real progress on the racial front from the time that picture was taken of Dr. King playing pool. And yet on the other hand, there really does remain a significant and stubborn portion of the population that will not stop challenging this progress, that will not stop contending that democracy itself is suspect, that the election was somehow stolen, that the fewer people able to vote, the better, and that when these other people somehow do manage to cast their ballots, then their very presence in the electoral process is a form of getting over. And when all objections and challenges are dismissed in court, some went so far as to attempt to overturn a free and fair election by force. Even something so basic as the historical awareness that precisely what makes our society superior to others that came before it, that what makes it one to be proud of and one worth fighting for, is and has always been the peaceful transfer of power between administrations when the people, our conception of whom, of course, over the centuries and decades has expanded, when the people have come together and chosen their head of state. It's understandable. It can feel good to ignore a complicated reality and bask instead in the simple pleasures of self-righteous outrage and victimization. We're all increasingly incentivized to do this. At the same time, so bombarded are we all now by contradictory opinions and deliberate disinformation. And so flimsy has our relationship to fact and the pursuit of truth become, that our handle on even the very recent past is often under direct assault. Perhaps nothing better illustrates the current American confusion with history, and with race too, than recent debates around free speech. We have encountered arguments from both the left and the right that seek to stifle an opponent's ability to express a viewpoint when it is expedient, without taking seriously Rosa Luxemburg's admonition that freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. A freedom secured on the unfreedom or exclusion of others is no freedom at all. Rather than striving for King's mountaintop, where we might all be free to be judged by the content of our character, which is to say, by what we say and do, and not by our identities alone, which is also to admit that some of us will be found to come up lacking. That's the truth. We are instead busily burrowing into safe spaces where, along with those who look and think just like we do, we can avoid ever having to re-examine our biases. We can avoid ever having to test the real world persuasiveness and durability of our views. No matter how well-intentioned an impulse it may be, this is a problematic way of thinking, to say the least. History, after all, just like the present day, is not and cannot ever be something that always feels good. It is, however, always something that we have to try to come to grips with in order to move forward. Whether we ignore history or end up obsessing over a single aspect of it, the purpose is always to try to uncomplicate the present, to reduce it, and in the process to make oneself feel at ease. In fact, you could say that one of the great problems plaguing our society today comes down to this. Should we, for the sake of feeling good, allow ourselves to accept stupid ideas, misinterpretations, distortions, and even outright lies? One can answer, yes, that's a fine thing to do, or no, it's better to refuse, or I really don't care, I'm indifferent. But that is a question all of us are faced with every day, and the way we choose to answer it will matter deeply. What I've come to realize whenever I reflect back on this nation's history and my own history within it, a history which does not always feel good and which runs back through my father to my great-great-grandfather, a slave in Louisiana. When I think back on all this, what I realize is that it is my responsibility and my duty to all who came before me to do everything I can to distinguish between what is real and what is illusory, what is necessary, right, and true, and what merely feels good. As a society, we have come too far to lose historical perspective and give in to the confusions of our moment. As we stop now to celebrate another anniversary of the birth of one of our country's greatest men, as we reconnect with our painful and glorious past, we must also stop and ask ourselves if we too are willing to see ourselves and each other in all of our fullness, contradiction, and complexity. The collision between one's image of oneself and what one actually is always very painful. And there are two things you can do about it. James Baldwin, Martin Luther King's great oratorical contemporary, famously cautioned, quote, "You can meet the collision head on and try to become what you really are, or you can retreat and try to remain what you thought you were, which is a fantasy in which you will certainly perish," end quote. As so many recent events have illustrated sharply, we're still clinging to fantasies, but fortunately we haven't yet perished. As long as we're here, we'll need to find the courage to meet this collision head on. We have no other options. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those very thoughtful remarks. Great for our audience and great opening for conversation between us. I just want to remind the audience that I'm going to pose some questions to Thomas Williams for about 30 minutes now, but please use the Q&A function in chat to, the Q&A function in Zoom, excuse me, to pose some questions for him for our final segment. Let me start with your theme of the search for truth, for reality about the complexity of a free, liberal democratic society, America in particular, and the need to remind ourselves of the temptation of falling into our own closed, comfortable ways of thinking, tempting illusions. you, as I mentioned in the introduction, were, I believe, the lead author, instigator behind the Harpers letter that was very prominently discussed this past summer and had very prominent signatories. I'll just say our school, we have about 12 of the signatories, 12 of the initial signatories, at least, we've had as speakers in our Civic Discourse project over the past 4 years. So if you would talk for a little bit more about this particular set of questions about Martin Luther King and racial justice and civil rights for all Americans, and the way in which that has become one instance of this view in higher education, in the media, in other elite institutions, that certain viewpoints cannot be tolerated. Certain points of view about questions of race and justice in America have been shown to be simply wrong or unjust or themselves intolerant, and we should no longer tolerate them in discussion. And the Harpers letter makes a very strong argument that as you just said, we need to have debate to refine our thinking and test and check our thinking on important topics.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much there that you raise, and so much of it's important. You know, Martin Luther King is a figure who is so rich, and his example is so iconic at this point that many people can use aspects of his life to make points that sometimes are in tension with each other. But one thing that we know is that the movement that he embodied and that he led was one for a kind of racially transcendent humanism. It was one for a society based on universally accessible values and rights and laws, and one that was striving for an endpoint where differences in physical characteristics would be simply that. They would be differences in physical characteristics, and we wouldn't derive sense of worth or sense of superiority and inferiority out of those things. That movement gave way to something else, which has become over the past few decades. I don't want to make it seem like it's just happened now, but in the decades since the civil rights movement, and gaining a lot of steam, I would say, since the second term of the Obama administration, with all the kind of dissatisfaction that arose in the wake of having elected the first Black president and realizing that that hadn't solved all of our nation's ills. I think that we've really come to a point where identity has been, we've reinvested so much significance into identity. We've gone in the opposite direction of what, at its best, the civil rights movement had blown open for American society. And so now we kind of live in the cult of, you know, of identity, and it's on both sides of the political spectrum. You have a kind of nostalgic white identity politics that infuses parts of the right that were very invested in their champion, Donald Trump. And you have on the left an extraordinarily fractured identity coalition of dozens of groups that interact with each other in the society at large as though they have a kind of unbridgeable perspective that has to be listened to and respected, and that is rooted in a kind of particular oppression, but can never be fully understood or appreciated by those who do not participate in that identity. So they have inaccessible knowledge. You know, it's something that the economist Glenn Loury has termed identity epistemology. I'm a mixed race Black man, so you can only listen to what I can tell you about what my life is like. And since it's rooted in a certain amount of suffering, you really can't contradict me. This is a very dangerous way of going, but we've been going this way for a long time. And you know, in the country's academic, cultural, and media institutions, really, we've started down a road that I think is antithetical to to the real insights of the civil rights movement, which is that actually there is no such thing as identity epistemology rooted in unbridgeable experiences. We all, with respect and with dedication and commitment and compassion, we all can understand each other's human experiences. And in fact, we must if we want to achieve the society that we claim to want to inhabit.
So before we move on to other themes that arise in your most recent book, Self-Portrait, just to clarify on this point, you are making the argument, you state clearly in many writings, including Self-Portrait, you're not denying that there is a long history of racism, anti-Black or slavery and descendants of slaves, that kind of racism, among other kinds of racism. What you're arguing on this particular point is that for America as a liberal democracy to achieve, we'll talk more about this, principles of universal community and equal rights, we must tolerate a range of viewpoints about what is our history on race, what should we do now about it. We have to have robust discourse and accept a range of views, and each participant would have to accept that there are views out there I don't agree with, but need to sort of survive or not survive, be refined or be left behind in this contest of ideas.
Contest is a good way to put it. I mean, absolutely, is there racism? Without a doubt. Have things really improved since the time we're talking about when Dr. King was marching, or, since my father was a young man prior to the Civil Rights Act? And yeah, things have changed quite a lot, but racism is with us. I would never want to gainsay that. But I think that also we have to be able to have a kind of multi track vision. We have to keep our eye on the present moment and the challenges that it presents. And we also have to keep a kind of another eye focused farther down the road at the future that we'd like to arrive at. And I think that you can't arrive at a future that transcends racism so long as you cling to the categories that were created in the collision of Africa and Europe in the New World through the slave trade. That's those abstract color categories that we're still bound by, that many of us, in fact, the overwhelming majority of us now fully acknowledge are not rooted in biological reality. Those color categories that we nonetheless keep reproducing socially bind us to the racism that we say we deplore. So I think that we have to acknowledge racism and fight it, but it's not enough to be anti-racist. You have to actually, and this is what I argue in the book, Self-Portrait, you have to arrive at an anti-race position if you really want to get out of the trap of racism, because the two are inextricably linked. That's one thing. And to your point about a contest of ideas and a contest of speech, absolutely, we have to hear ideas that even are wrong. We have to have ideas that even offend us and we object to, because there's a variety of reasons. One crucial reason is we don't always know what we don't know. And when you're depriving yourself from being exposed to differing viewpoints, you're depriving yourself of ever fully testing your blind spots. The other thing is you're not challenging your own, if you're only in a kind of echo chamber where people either agree with you or are afraid to disagree because the penalty is too high, then you're never challenging whether your own presuppositions are worthy of your allegiance or not. So that's just a couple of, just two off the top of my head, two reasons why we have to have a real robust public square where people can oppose views and viewpoints, and people can have, the right to actually be wrong, because you can't learn if you assume you come to every exchange fully equipped with all the knowledge you'll ever need.
Well, let's move on to some of the specific ideas about transcending race that are in your most recent book, Self-Portrait in Black and White. I wanted to ask about the subtitle you chose for it, Unlearning Race. You've already mentioned Glenn Loury, Brown University economist, and you quote in the book his idea that the American bedrock idea is the goal of racially transcendent humanism. So your argument is that we really do need to see that race is not a reality in the way some of us think race is a dominant social, political, interpersonal reality, right? Racism is real, but to live our lives according to race should not be our goal, as you've just said. So a criticism is that this is not itself real, given the horrible history of racism, persistence of it today, especially against Blacks. It's naive. It's even impossible to think what Dr. King thought 50 some odd years ago, that we could ever elevate individuality. You quoted his phrase, thinking of each other according to the content of our character, not the color of our skin. It's just naive or impossible. We now know more, I guess, than King knew. What is your response to that?
Oh, well, you know, my response, and I never want to attempt to prove a universal by a particular, but my response would be that, you know, things are not categorically the same at all times for everybody. And plenty of us do live lives already as though, not as though race is invisible or what we think of as what we think we perceive as race is invisible, but many of us do live lives that are more or less not defined by racial categories. Many of us do interact with each other already in ways that are getting towards that kind of ideal. And I think many more of us could be brought into that. This is not to say that we're all going to be able to do this, or that everybody will even want to do this, but I think that a lot of thinking people of goodwill can actually make the push to minimize the salience that they give to so-called racial differences. We already know that in America, for example, we are already a genetically mixed up people. We have been for centuries. The average African-American, her family has been in America for longer than most Americans, and is on average 80% West African descended and 20% Northern European descended. And there are millions of white Americans, many of whom don't even realize it until they do DNA tests, who are walking around right now with enough West African DNA in them to have been enslaved in previous eras under the laws of hypodescent. We are actually on the genetic level already a mongrel society. We have lots of myths and customs and habits that dissuade us from acknowledging that very simple truth, but it's a truth that's been around for a long time. My own process of unlearning these habits and myths, of seeing myself and seeing others, began only a few years ago in earnest. I grew up, I was born in 1981. My father is a sociologist by training, a Black man from the segregated South, old enough to be my grandfather. He grew up in the 40s and 50s in Texas. My mother is a white evangelical Christian from Southern California, also with a background in sociology. My parents never believed that race was biologically significant, but they did raise my brother and me with the kind of typically American point of view that a drop of Black blood makes a person Black. And so though I grew up in a mixed household, it was kind of an open and closed question for me that I was a Black man in America. And I didn't think very hard about this until I found myself 29, 30 years old, suddenly married to a white French woman who I realized was colored the same way as my mother was, blonde hair, blue eyed. And it started to dawn on me that my children might push my concept of the one drop rule to its breaking point. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. When my daughter was born in 2013, her very physical presence, I guess I would say, thrust the fiction of racial identity before my consciousness in a way that it had never been present in my mind, even in my own life, in my own mixed household. And so I began to proceed from a very basic question which most people don't have to ask themselves, but I don't think it's unique to my family. I think it actually applies to us all. But I was forced to ask myself, how can I be a different race than my daughter? How can my daughter be a different race than my father? How can I be somewhere in between my daughter and father who are separate races? It didn't make sense to me. I saw that my daughter had the same smile as my father. I knew that we were all one family. And so this veil of color that separates us, it no longer made sense to me. And so that was the beginning of this book. And it was a 4-year process of writing the book. And I didn't really give myself permission to fully reject race. It was very difficult to do. I didn't give myself fully permission to reject race until in 2017, I profiled an artist named Adrian Piper, an artist and philosopher who lives in Berlin and who, as an art project, had publicly retired from being Black. She's a Black woman, very light-skinned, who can pass for many things. And she did it as a kind of ironic art gesture, but in talking with her about why that might be something that you can give yourself permission to do, I realized that actually, you know, an allegiance to a logic that comes out of slavery and comes out of the plantation is not necessarily an allegiance to who I really am. It's an allegiance to a way of thinking in an American society that I think we might be able to do better by getting beyond.
Let me move to the communal sort of question. So your argument in the book and in other writings is that the focus on identity and race identity is not real to the lived experience of many people, given our, as you just said, our sort of genetic mixing. But there's a further dimension in here. As we were talking before the webinar began, you know, this is the day inaugurating a new presidential administration, a new Congress is in Washington, D.C. at this very divisive time. But the new president emphasizing American unity. So you have a criticism of the language of systemic racism in the book, critical of the Black Lives Matter movement, of Ta-Nehisi Coates, among others, who emphasize systemic racism and race consciousness. And I just wanted to ask, beyond the individual level, that this is not true to the reality of many people in America, you're also talking about the fact that a healthy society, in this case, a healthy America, requires a common social, political community, and we can't have that unless we try to live in our own way. Martin Luther King's idea of transcending race consciousness. If we're always focused on divisions by race, we can't ever be in America. Could you respond to that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so I don't know that I reject systemic racism. There are institutional processes that certainly disfavor certain groups disproportionately. I would say that it's often much more complicated than the story of mere color can make it seem. There is something that happens in America when race, specifically Blackness, but not exclusively Blackness, intersects with poverty and with the cultural signifiers of poverty and the lack of kind of social capital that comes from having been in impoverished, segregated communities. I don't doubt that. And I don't deny that, especially in the criminal justice system, there can be processes that we really do have to take seriously and that are gonna require more than merely individual goodwill. But I also take seriously, again, Adrian Piper's argument that first and foremost, racism is an interpersonal process. And that the way that what racism does is racism functions as a kind of veil that slips between me and you and doesn't allow me to see you for who you actually are. It's a stereotype. It's something else that I apply on top of you. And it's a shorthand for allowing me to think I know what you are without actually having to interact with you in your entirety and your complexity and your singularity. So on that level, racism is something that we individually do have to be responsible for. I think that there's a way that Coates and many others of this moment talk about racism as though it's impersonal, as though it's a force out there in the world. And it's almost paradoxically a way of absolving people from ever having to do anything, from ever having to confront their own attitudes, behaviors, and actions. And so it's that tension that I want to draw attention to, but also in terms of Black Lives Matter and the idea of, you know, systemic discrimination. I think that reality is often more complicated than that too. You know, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Many of the goals that Black Lives Matter espouses I share. Would we like to live in a society where fewer people are physically destroyed by police, where fewer people are killed in interactions with law enforcement? Absolutely, that's a goal that they have, that's a goal that I share. I think most Americans share that goal. It's astonishing from where I sit in Europe, in France, which is, you know, dealing with its own problems, but is nowhere near the American level of violence. American police kill, on balance, 1,000 Americans a year. You know, 500 of those 1,000 Americans are going to be whites. You have a much larger population, white population, so disproportionately the 250 who are Black, it's a disproportionate amount. The population that gets killed at the most extreme proportion is Native Americans, but we barely even talk about that. My point is that all Americans have an interest in reducing the amount of fellow citizens who are killed in encounters with law enforcement. By grounding this argument strictly in the logic and language of race, it can win empathy. It can make others want to be allies, but it doesn't implicate them in the process of fully buying into the values if they were universal. If the value is that fewer people should be killed by cops, we don't need the identity argument. In fact, I'm afraid that many people who don't see themselves in the specific identity that Black Lives Matter is highlighting will think that it's a problem that doesn't pertain to them. And so I think a more durable victory would be to get all Americans to care about the value that's at stake, as opposed to the identity that's at stake in the moment.
Well, again, that comes back to the King view. And in the I Have a Dream address, he invokes the founding principles of the country by name, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I just want to mention, if we were here in person having an event with you, and we will have you to campus someday, we would be distributing our copy of our pocket Constitution, which includes, in addition to the Declaration of the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream address. But as you know, the question of intersections with race, but King was very focused on questions of poverty and economic equality or economic opportunity in the last 5 years of his life. My final question to you, before, and a reminder to everybody, please put questions into the Q&A. We have quite a few popping in, so that's great. A final question to you, bringing it a little closer, this set of issues closer to home, to a university community, and how to address concerns about systemic racism or the need to be affirmatively anti-racist, which has been a rising set of terms and concerns since the George Floyd's killing this past summer. So within American higher education, to take one institution, there's been a concern about the lower proportion of Black faculty members compared to the proportion of Blacks in American society in general, and therefore we should have targeted hiring. Beyond sort of thinking about affirmative action in admissions, we should have faculty positions specifically targeting Black people. Only Black people can apply for the positions and be possibly accepted. So there's a larger question there about affirmative action, which I think you've written about, that you're not opposed to it categorically. But in the context of your larger argument in your recent book and since then about a healthier society, needing to remind ourselves of this transcendent humanism, universal transcendent humanism, what do you think about these kinds of measures in particular institutions, in elite institutions, about how to address concerns with past or possibly current racism?
I mean, it's a very tricky question. I certainly, I'm not categorically opposed to the idea that for people who have been traditionally excluded from certain spaces, there might be the need to either proactively recruit them, because they may have learned over time that these spaces are not for them, and they may not even know they may be qualified and not know to be applying. And perhaps there must be some targeted hiring and perhaps some positions reserved at certain times to make up for an extreme dearth of representation. But I'm very uncomfortable with that being open-ended. For that to make sense, there has to be a target to reach, and there has to be a point at which everybody can agree that that has been accomplished. It cannot be a kind of open-ended, unlimited situation in which, I'm sorry, am I still there with you?
You're still with us,
okay.
yeah.
Sorry, I got
open-ended
popping up suddenly. It cannot be open-ended, and we cannot get into a kind of de facto position where it's tacitly accepted that certain groups are never to be expected to compete for spaces without assistance. That makes me profoundly uncomfortable. That's not a world I want to live in. I don't want to benefit from a situation in which the door for me to get into certain institutions is an easier door to pass through than it is for other people by random happenstance of physical characteristics and birth. I'm really uncomfortable with that. So if there are specific problems to address, I think it's it's equally absurd to pretend that everything is fine now and there has been no history of systematic exclusion. But it's a very, very tricky position to get right, and I think it always risks reinscribing notions of Black inferiority and to an extent Latino inferiority as well. And it also has a strange way of kind of punishing Asians, to be honest, because they're not white, but they also outperform whites. And so for it all to work, Asians are the group that when the music stops, don't get a seat. So I'm profoundly uncomfortable with the unfairness of that as well.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. And now we'll move to a broader conversation with the audience. We have quite a few interesting questions that have come in to the queue. I'll start with a question from Cody about the Harpers letter and the principle of free discourse. Critics of the Harpers letter often refer to the violence that words can cause, creating a safety issue in a community or a workspace. So how can we balance the need for empathy toward those who are affected by particular arguments or claims, while on the other hand, defending those claims and promoting open discussion?
Yeah, I mean, the language of safety, I think, is one of the new twists that's really started to change the way that we think about speech. And I think it's honestly, again, there is language that threatens safety, but most of what we talk about does not reach that level. And so I think we have to have a very thick skin, to be honest. I think that we have to really set the bar very high for what we consider to be speech that threatens safety. I think that we've had a kind of concept creep about trauma and other kind of therapeutic terms that have allowed many of us to think of language that really is actually just disagreeable, unpleasant, offensive, annoying, stupid, vulgar, as actually crossing a line into making certain identities unsafe. And I think we actually have to be a lot more resilient than that. That's my honest view there. Yeah,
Okay.
the language of safety also introduces, it's a strategic move in certain situations in the workplace, especially in corporate situations. It introduces kind of legal responses that have to be taken. And so I think it kind of, what it does is it just shuts down debate and it's a tool for shutting down debate as opposed to actually thinking through what are scenarios in which we can all strengthen our empathy muscles.
Okay, a question from Roy. To what extent do you think racism is promoted by the many government requirements for tracking people by race in employment, in higher education, et cetera?
That's a very good question. Where I live now in France, that's illegal. The government and institutions cannot track by race. The word race has been struck from all official government documents and the Constitution, all legal documents do not recognize that term. And, so we can contrast the two societies in certain ways. That hasn't actually introduced a perfect utopia, because what it does is actually, in some ways we can't see when certain groups are actually suffering based on discrimination. We can't actually understand what's going on in the criminal justice system as precisely as we can in America, because everybody in jail is just French, even though it seems to be that there's a disproportionate amount of Arabs in jail. So there are still problems when you live in a society that has real racism in it. There are problems with fully jumping into color blindness or getting rid of the ability to use certain terms that are compromised but that are necessary in the present moment. With that said, I think that, the question, the commenter is correct to put their finger on the fact that every time we participate in this racecraft, every time we use the terms, we reinscribe those terms into reality and make sure that they will be with us that much longer. So it's it's a real dilemma. Every time we have quotas or we have a target amount of identity groups that have to come into a space, we make sure that false notion of division that I do think we ultimately have to get by, we make sure that it is that much more a part of our day-to-day reality. And so how do we get through that? That's the question. How do we thread that needle? How do we make sure that we don't sweep real discrimination and real exclusion under the rug, real abuse under the rug? And how do we get to that? How do we get to that point in time where everybody is actually allowed to be an individual?
Well, since we're getting easy questions from the audience, let me pose another one that came in. This is a participant who just describes herself as in the center. And it's on the theme of American unity and our polarization about this issue and other issues. So on the one hand, she writes, if those who are the wokest prefer to constantly focus on race rather than actual character or content of ideas, and this is also true of the right in its own way, have a sort of a deep and troubling vengeance against anyone not falling in line with their ideology. So on both sides, how do we diffuse that polarity as Americans?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that has really degraded our ability to interact with each other is the prevalence of the social media bubbles that we all inhabit now, the kind of ability to curate our interaction with reality to only buttress and reinforce our priors, to filter out news we disagree with, to completely have the world brought to us in palettes that we pre-approve of. This is a problem. I think that the first thing that we can all do, that someone in a college campus can do, is get out and talk to somebody who actually identifies politically differently than you do, who actually disagrees with you. Talk and listen, try to persuade that person as opposed to castigate or vilify them, but also come prepared to potentially be persuaded yourself. I think that we have to engage each other. This is exactly what the most strident ideologues on the right and the left try to make sure that we can't do. They try to make the other anathema and therefore not worth engaging. And we can't get to where we need to be so long as we do that. We can't stay in our filter bubbles. We have to engage each other, and a college campus is the place I think where that can happen. It's maybe one of the easiest institutional spaces for that to happen.
There's another question from Dominic. I think you've already addressed it in a way, though, and we did have a separate question about social media, which I think you've addressed. But how technology can assist. You mentioned photography as a technology that helped you to understand Martin Luther King. But ways of having conversation, assessing how different technologies can assist or inhibit this kind of serious conversation and exchange of views. Do you have other advice about that? I mean, I think you're saying get off social media and actually.
I'm not one to speak, unfortunately.
No, but be aware of how much social media might be affecting you, and be sure to actually talk to people, which may be face to face. It could be through other mediums of technology, right?
Well, yeah, I would have always advised face to face, because oftentimes people that you think are awful online are quite different in person. You know, the kind of interactions that were algorithmically pushed into having with each other are extreme interactions. You can either kind of like really energetically approve and retweet and support a statement, or you can dunk on that statement and really try to tear it down and vilify the person who made the statement. But it's very difficult to just do a kind of nuanced interaction in these social media environments, especially when you know, we're all incentivized to get as many likes and you know, and public reinforcement for taking the stronger, harder view than we might actually hold in person. So I think talking to people face to face is really where it's at. But I would say on social media, I mean, don't just follow people that you agree with. Really challenge yourself to follow people who make the opposite argument in the strongest way possible. Not the people that are incendiary or are just trolling, but the people who make a strong version of the argument that's opposed to what you're predisposed to believe is correct. That, and I would say diversify your news diet. If you read the New York Times every day, you should also check out the Bulwark or the Dispatch, or read the Wall Street Journal's op-ed page. And the opposite, if you're a conservative and you only read, if you only listen to Ben Shapiro, or you only, you know, read the Wall Street Journal, then you should actually seriously consider reading some of the writers far on the left at The Atlantic or in The Nation or places like that, and take seriously the arguments they're making in the best form. I think one of the things that has really ripped our country apart is the degree to which we don't even know what other people are listening to. We've seen, I mean, with the rise of OAN, Newsmax, we've seen people even ditching like Fox News to get an extreme curated bubble. And we see people on the left doing much the same thing. Although I think in the case of Trump propaganda, it was a specific problem that hopefully will get solved going forward. But the fact remains that we don't know what other people are thinking, and we come to conversations oftentimes using the same words and the same terms and referring to the same events, but bringing completely different knowledges to those interactions. And so I think the extent to which you can understand a variety of viewpoints is the extent to which you'll have a much fuller and I think more enjoyable interaction.
Thank you. And now Carol McNamara is helping me with questions behind the scenes, is helping me to put together two questions. So I should say thank you to Ryan and to Dominic for those questions about social media and technology. And now to combining questions from Luis and from Sean. Are there tensions between trying to transcend race as a category on the one hand, and on the other hand, celebrating one's own connections to one's family, culture, history? How can we reconcile the desire to get beyond race, but not abandon those important human, cultural, historical attachments?
That's a great question. And, I think that, it's important to be honest. Probably most people don't want to throw themselves into individualism to the degree to which even I'm comfortable. Most people get a lot of satisfaction out of belonging to community and to belonging to groups. And a lot of people don't want to be fully responsible for creating from scratch the community they belong to. There's nothing wrong with that. We're proud of our religious communities. We're proud of our ethnicities. I think that all of that is fine. I'm very proud of the, of the variety of traditions that I come from, specifically proud to come from a Black cultural tradition that I think is rooted in the kind of resilience that we spoke about a bit today, exemplified by Dr. King. That's, that's really achieved quite a lot. But I don't think any of that has to do with blood and skin, and I don't think that that has to do with abstract color categories. I think actually what would help us a lot would be if we had at the same time a much more specific idea of who we are and a much broader idea of who we are. So who are you? You're on your mother's side, you're Armenian Jews. On your father's side, you come from a town outside of Cork in Ireland. And you yourself were raised in a specific part of Brooklyn and New York City on the East Coast you have a regional identity, and you're fully an American. I think that makes much more sense than ascribing some idea of monolithic whiteness to yourself that links you with Mayflower wasps and Russian immigrants. I mean, and Italians, the idea that you participate in a monolithic whiteness kind of actually erases that specificity that makes you who you are and that gives you your ethnic identity that it makes sense to be proud of. On the other hand, you're fully racially human, as we all are, and you participate in that larger human community that it might sound cheesy to shout out, but that is really the community we always have to keep our eye on too. It's the membership in that community that allows us not to demonize those we disagree with or who look different from us or who've come from different places. So what makes sense to me is to have a very, very highly specific concept of yourself, which requires, doing genealogy, maybe doing even genetic testing, understanding where you come from, understanding what your family has done to get you to be an American, understanding that on a very granular level, and then also never losing sight of the human level that connects you with people with far different ethnic experiences.
Thank you. I think we might have time for just one more. It depends, but this is a question seeking some advice about the kinds of conversations you're recommending. Discussions among peers about questions of race. It comes from Anthony, who says he would be perceived as a white man. Mm-hmm. What could he say to a Black friend or a colleague if they totally reject the idea that America is not a systemically racist society and the need to continue to think in categories of race? What particular kinds of advice might you have in that situation?
What could he say if a non-white friend continues to see the need to think in terms of race?
Yes.
Well,
I think you get the easy questions from our.
I think that the honest truth is that none of this gets solved so long as white people, no matter how well-intentioned, kind of think that race is a problem outside of them, that race is something that others have, and that whites kind of have to be quiet and can't really have a position on it because whites don't have race. Or that, whites are kind of default normal mode and that race is something that other people suffer with. I think really what whites can do that would really be helpful is to first think seriously about the ways in which white identity is also a racial construct, that whites participate in the construction of race in American society the same as other racial groups do, but oftentimes it's been made invisible, or people like my mother have been raised in an America in which they don't think of themselves as having a race. It's just the air that exists. I think white people can think of themselves as racialized and then can make serious attempts to reject that the same way that I would ask people for whom race has been an imposition and a source of oppression to reject it. I would ask white people to consciously reject the racial construct. But it's going to invite a lot of criticism, and it's going to require being able to know the history. It's going to require being able to speak seriously about racism that other groups have suffered, acknowledge that, don't deny that, but keep your eye on the kind of society that you hope to achieve, which would be one in which the person you're talking to doesn't feel, maybe they don't feel imprisoned in their racial identity, but one in which you could participate outside the confines of these racial constructs. I hope that wasn't a terribly unclear answer. It's a very complicated subject. I get into it in the book, but basically my short answer is that we can't transcend race unless white people fully come on board with first understanding how they've been raced, and second, subverting that racial construction themselves.
In the book, you talk about the example of your cousin, right? Of a well-meaning cousin, but that this is something that needs to be.
You can't just skip to colorblindness. You have to work through the white identity that you've been given in this society, and consciously reject it too. And I think that those kinds of gestures, my experience with other Black and Latino and minority groups and individuals, is that kind of gesture coming from whites could be perceived as the opening gambit that can allow people to feel that they can demilitarize their identity as well.
Well, thank you so much. We have come to the end of our time. We left a few audience questions on the table. Thank you to everyone for sending in terrific questions. I want to make a note. We're grateful to you, Thomas, for agreeing to have a separate now follow-on conversation privately with several students in our school, which will be occurring right after the webinar concludes. So thank you to everyone who joined us for this 5th webinar in our theme this year in the Civic Discourse Project on Race, Justice, and Leadership in America. We ask you to please check the video catalog on our website. That's at skettle.asu.edu. It has the recordings for the first 4 webinars in the series on George Washington with Bill Allen, a discussion with Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School on debates about racism in American higher education today, a discussion about Frederick Douglass with Danielle Allen and Peter Myers, and a discussion on Lincoln's views of America, race, and justice with Lucas Morel. You can also check the school's website for information on the upcoming events this spring in the Race, Justice, and Leadership series. We will be having discussions with Glenn Lowry and with Shelby Steele. As always, I'm grateful to our colleagues in the school who made this webinar possible, our terrific team of Dr. Carol McNamara, Associate Director for Public Programs, Joe Martin, our Communications Manager, and Morgan Raddick from our events team. We have great thanks to our guest, Thomas Chatterton Williams, for sharing his expertise and his insights today. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us. Be well and have a good day.